Welcome to State of the World with me, Sally Lockwood in Dubai.
And me, Tara Palmeri in New York. Sally, what a week. I really want to hear from you about what everyone is talking about in the Middle East, because in Washington right now, it's like rage against the reporters and the media for breaking this report, this leaked intelligence report that showed that President Trump's strike, the US's strike on Iran on the 3 nuclear facilities, that it only set the country back a few months in terms of its nuclear program. And, obviously Trump has declared this world peace, 12-day war is over, but this sort of shatters any sort of like monumental progress, any idea that the US has just shut down, the idea that he is deserving of recognition for ending Iran's program. What are you hearing in the Middle East? Like, what are people saying right now about all this?
Hi, T. I mean, it's been another mental week, hasn't it?
Yeah.
We actually haven't even spoken ourselves this week because it's been so busy. You've been so busy covering the political war that's going on in America. And obviously I've been covering the actual war that's happening in the Middle East.
Right.
And I would say what Americans are caring about in terms of the media in the US is very different to what we care about over here.
Okay.
So for you guys, it's all about how credible this intelligence is, how this is impacting Donald Trump and his administration, how much damage was done to these nuclear facilities, et cetera, et cetera. Over here, missiles were flying across the Gulf this week towards Qatar, one of the safest countries in the world. It was wild. I got a phone call around an hour before it happened to say, oh, by the way, airspace has been shut. We think Qatar might get attacked tonight. And this was the foreign news desk at Sky News in London calling me. And I said, no. I was like, that's ridiculous. That's not going to happen. Iran would not be mad enough to attack Qatar. And they said, well, we just want to check you're available, just in case it happens. I was like, yeah, sure, give me a call. I didn't give it another thought. I was like rocking my toddler to sleep. And then 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. And they said, it's happening. Get up. We want you live. It's happening. I could not believe it. And I would say for around an hour, maybe 2 hours, but for some of the evening, people here were really scared. Even the airspace around the UAE was cleared. And, Dubai is one of the busiest airports in the world. So many flights fly through here. So many nationalities, more than 200 nationalities live here. And one of the reasons people choose to live here is because it is one of the safest countries in the world. Security is not something that people have to think about here. There's not even any crime. I don't even take the keys out of the car when I park it. We don't lock the front door. So the fact that people had to suddenly think about their safety was nuts, And it wasn't just here. I mean, the reality was shutting the airspace here was precautionary, right? But I guess we thought the same about Qatar. Qatar has a relationship with Iran. They have huge shared commercial interests. I mean, the fact that Iran was going to fire missiles into Qatar was just unfathomable, but that it happened. And I heard from a family that I know in Doha and various other residents who just talked about how scared they were. There was this family hiding in a cupboard under the stairs, Tara, in Doha, and they felt their house shake up to 10 times. And the house shook with such force, they couldn't believe that the windows didn't break. This is not a country that is used to having to worry about conflict and war. So it was absolutely extraordinary. And then, of course, we learned later on in the evening that the attack on Al Udeid airbase, that enormous American airbase in Qatar, it was coordinated, okay? So the Iranians had a back channel to the Americans. They had a back channel to Gulf nations. Everyone was warned. It was coordinated. It was choreographed and orchestrated in order to give Iran an off-ramp, right? Which it did. And in a way, there was a sense of relief that we'd had the retaliation. People were worried for, ever since America attacked those nuclear facilities in Iran, there was real worry here about what Iran was going to do, how they were going to react. So I think there was a sense of relief. Okay, so they've done it now. But I guess the question is that it?
That's the thing. Is it a real ceasefire? Because the next morning, that you see Iran firing on Israel, Israel fires back on Iran. Trump is saying, dropping F-bombs on his way out to NATO because clearly his ceasefire is extremely fragile. I mean, do you feel like it is safer today than it was a week ago?
The golden question. I think we are still waiting to see. I think there's a lot of concern. It definitely feels like the temperature is lowered. And I think when we woke up the next morning after that attack on Qatar, I think there was a sense of relief when we saw the news that Donald Trump had announced this ceasefire. The temperature had really been taken down. There wasn't going to be some retaliatory reaction for Iran trying to attack that American airbase. They knew it was going to happen. Everyone played their part. They evacuated the airbase. The air defense shot down the missiles. Iran got to save face. No damage was done. Okay, the bill's paid. Let's just call it quits, essentially. And so I think there was a sense of relief that Donald Trump called this ceasefire. But then, of course, it didn't even start right when it was supposed to. There was a lot of confusion about timings of when it was going to start anyway.
Right.
But both sides very quickly started accusing the other of violating the ceasefire, literally within an hour of the ceasefire supposedly coming into effect. So it was like a fake ceasefire, essentially. It just didn't start. And then Donald Trump let rip with those furious remarks outside the White House. And to be honest, Tara, I couldn't believe it. Like, I've never seen Donald Trump swear publicly like that before.
No, he curses all the time behind the scenes. It's his thing.
Okay. But publicly,
a lot of presidents do. Like Biden has a sailor mouth as well. Like they all do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know this stuff. I think for me, I don't live and breathe.
I know you think Trump's not presidential, so he probably acts the same way behind the scenes as he does in front of the cameras. But that is the one thing he doesn't usually curse in front of the cameras, which shows you how stressed he is.
Yeah. I thought it was quite impressive, actually. Whether he meant it to be or not, I think people liked that he said what a lot of people were thinking. And I think there was a sense that Israel was out of control and we didn't know, where they were going to draw the line in terms of saying, okay, this operation is over in terms of bombing Iran. Because to start with, they said they were just going to bomb nuclear facilities. And then suddenly it became airports and then a prison and, an infrastructure affiliated to the regime. So when Donald Trump, made that extraordinary outburst, which we'll drop in, let's have a listen.
You know what? We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Okay, so after he made those remarks, Tara, the ceasefire then started. It was extraordinary. Maybe, Donald Trump's way of doing diplomacy does work. I don't know. What was your take on it?
It's certainly different. I do think it's just a lot of theater. Like a lot of this felt like war theater, although 3 people died in Israel because of the counterstrike from Iran. We don't know the casualties really in Iran from the counterstrike. But I mean, President Trump had a lot on the line when he decided that they were going to send in these 30,000-pound bombs into Iran, and specifically politically. I mean, his base is America first, no foreign wars, no intervention. And he, there was a feeling that he was bringing the United States back into another war in Iran. And you know how that goes, not into Iran, but into the Middle East through Iran. And we haven't done so well in terms of wars in the Middle East. And so I think he had a lot on the line politically. People were surprised. You even told me that you had gotten an intelligence report earlier in the day before the bombs had dropped, and you didn't believe it either.
I think one of the reasons that I didn't believe it was that he said he was going to take 2 weeks to make that decision.
Yeah.
And then 2 days later, you got American Air Force dropping bombs on Iran. I just felt like the timing was really surprising. What do you have in terms of intel as to why he made that decision so quickly?
I don't have anything specific, but I think that number was kind of to throw off Iran in the same way, like trying to bring them to the table within 60 days was also a way to kind of throw off Iran, to not show their hand. It gave them a little bit more time to get Iran to the table. But I think ultimately they knew that they wouldn't come to the table. But even now, I mean, are they really honest brokers, any of them? This just feels like a very fragile ceasefire. And, they don't have any mechanisms to actually follow up with the ceasefire. You know what I mean? Like there are no mechanisms that make sure that they're actually carrying it out.
Yeah, I think what's encouraging though is that life has slowly returned to normal to a degree in Israel and in Iran. Cafes and businesses are slowly beginning to reopen. People are returning to the streets again. I mean, for Iranian and Israeli civilians, their life has ground to a halt in the last 2 weeks while this has all been going on. Commerce shut, schools shut, people were in shelters. It's been, horrendous. And I think, in a sense, things have definitely cooled down. Is it going to hold? Well, we haven't seen any Iranian proxies react yet. So Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, obviously, in Gaza are already fighting their own war. Then you have the Houthis in Yemen, all backed by Iran, all supporters of Iran, and Iranian-backed militia in Iraq as well. We've not seen any retaliatory attacks from those proxies, which is really interesting. Is that something that we could see happen in the coming weeks and months? I don't know. Possibly. But at the moment, it hasn't happened yet, which suggests Iran is weakened. But who knows? And the question I've got for you, Tara, is, of course, a lot of what is being discussed and argued over in Washington is how much damage did the US actually do? Did they succeed? Did they take out these nuclear capabilities that they are claiming they did? They said they obliterated Iran's nuclear program. Exactly. And then, of course, there was that leaked intelligence report to say, actually, at best, they've managed to set it back 6 months. And Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump, they're being extremely defensive about this. But the reality is we don't actually know yet.
Exactly. And the level of defensiveness about it makes us all think that they risked getting the United States in another foreign entanglement, and they didn't even have the intel to back it up again. It sounds very much like weapons of mass destruction, or at least like, and Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, has long said, and others have said, that Iran does not have, that it's not 3 months away from building a bomb, in the same way that Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying since probably 1996. Every time,
yeah, I think let's be clear here. There's a lot of discrepancy and conflicting opinion about the state of Iran's nuclear program. So you've got some experts, some analysts who say they weren't about to make a nuclear weapon. And then you've got the IAEA, so the UN watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, who said that they'd never seen such a level of enriched uranium in a country that didn't have a nuclear weapon, right? And then you also have to ask yourself, well, if they weren't doing anything nefarious, why was it buried 90 meters into a mountain? Okay, right. So I think obviously there are some who are saying, oh, they weren't months away from making a nuclear weapon. They weren't about to. But I think it is also credible to say that their nuclear program wasn't for just domestic innocent purposes.
I think the thing, Sally, is that as Americans, we're particularly sensitive to being dragged into wars in the Middle East. If this set back Iran's nuclear program by years, I think Americans will think it was a successful mission. If it was only a matter of months, they will feel like they were being dragged into it based on a lie. And that has political ramifications for President Trump. Otherwise, he wouldn't be having a complete meltdown over it right now and attacking our journalist from CNN, Natasha Bertrand, who received this intelligence report, and literally trying to withhold classified information from Congress, which has the right to see this kind of information. I mean, technically, before he made that strike, many argue that he should have had the approval of Congress. And again, this is going to be something that will create friction between President Trump and his base. If this is a clean, surgical strike, similar to the one that they did in Syria after the chemical attack on their people when Assad attacked his people back in the first term, the MOAP, maybe Trump, it's all forgotten, right? But I think it really depends on how this plays out. hopefully in a week from now, when you and I talk, it will feel even calmer where you are living. I hope it doesn't escalate.
So I think you're right. On the domestic front, it's tricky for Trump, right? Because he said he was going to pull America out of all foreign wars, and then obviously we've seen him get involved in Iran. Although he has said it's what one and done. They don't plan on this being a protracted intervention, but who knows? And then I think from this perspective in the Middle East, people look at America's track record of intervention in the Middle East, which hasn't necessarily worked for many countries. If you look at what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Iraq. And so now you've had intervention this time. And I think there is concern that this could have made the region less stable rather than more stable. Let's see.
I want to welcome our next guest, Brett Bruen, who is beaming into us from Madrid, just coming back from the NATO summit in the Hague. And Brett was a spokesperson for the National Security Council with a specialization in public diplomacy. He represented embassies overseas for the George W. Bush administration and the Barack Obama administration. So he is a civil servant, no politics here, straight shooter. Always love getting Brett's take, always refreshing. So thanks for coming on State of the World. This is our show where we cover foreign affairs.
Great to be with you.
Brett, thanks.
Hi, Brett. Great to have you on.
Hey, Sally. How are you?
Very well, thanks. I'm fascinated to hear what you have to say about the last couple of weeks. So much has happened, Brett, but given that you're in Europe and you've just left the NATO summit, should we just start there first? Donald Trump, they called it the Trump summit, didn't they? Donald Trump has got all these NATO members committing to 5% of GDP spending on defense, which is extraordinary. But I guess something that overshadowed that headline was the fact that Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, referred to Donald Trump as daddy, which was just the weirdest moment. And I just have to kick off with it. What happened there?
Well, daddy Warbucks.
Yeah, I mean, look, Rutte is trying to play Trumpian diplomacy. And the key there is flattery. You saw that in the text message that he sent while Trump was en route aboard Air Force One. And then obviously, in person, the more that you can do to not just put Trump front and center, but also to, say that everything that is happening in the world, from the sun shining down on us to, the trees and flowers blossoming, all of that is due to Trump's enormous role in making it happen. And so you saw that on display in The Hague, but it worked. And this is something going back to Trump's first term that I have been telling foreign leaders. Look, the substance doesn't matter. It's the superficial stuff. You use the compliments, you use the flattery, and then, with a sort of judo move, and this is something that diplomats are used to doing. How do I take Trump's interest in Greenland and say, that is brilliant. I love the fact that you're so focused on the Arctic. You're so focused on the penguins. Now let's come over here and have a substantive conversation with your staff. But, I think this is something that particularly here in Europe, leaders have struggled with because they like the process. They like having that, protocol and the formality, and that just doesn't work. And let's also be honest here. It's not only Trump. It is a reality. And we've seen this pop up, not just from populist leaders. We can talk about Tara, the New York mayoral election, but, from leaders around the world, groups around the world that are pushing what are the boundaries, not only of diplomacy and international relations, but just our interconnectedness and the communications that we use.
I covered the first NATO summit, and I remember as coming from Europe, covering European Union, European Council, and a lot of those players were meeting Trump for the first time at the NATO summit back in 2017, and they weren't sure how to deal with him, and they learned pretty quickly that flattery was the best way to deal with President Trump. But I want to caveat the whole 5%. I know you said, Sally, that it was mind-blowing, but it's over a decade. Okay.
Yeah, that's
and I
true.
think there's 1% of it, 1.5% of it is not necessarily, it's for infrastructure. It doesn't actually go directly into defense spending. So they're really not, this is really just for show. Again, another display of theater. It's like our war theater that we were talking about earlier. Now it's just
but it gives Trump the headline that he needs, right?
He wants
and
to
it
win.
gives the Europeans the headline to say that they're actually doing something, even though they're sort of fudging the lines of like how much spending and when and what is going on. And I think it's really interesting, Brett, that, you know, aside from the daddy comment, which let's park that, poor Mark Rutte, I think will be haunted by that for life. It was maybe not the right choice of word, but I understand what he was trying to do and trying to say. The deference of European leaders, though, in this second term towards Donald Trump is really clear. Like, you see it all the time. Is it working? Do you think that Donald Trump do you think it's good for relations, or do you think that he sees it as weak?
Well, I think it is working, at least on the security front. You know, we can now unpack the economic and the trade front, where Europe has struggled more, albeit Keir Starmer did manage to get something of a flimsy trade agreement with Donald Trump. But that being said, look, I do think sitting here in Spain and having Pedro Sanchez as the, you know, one holdout saying, nope, I'm not going to 5%. And Tara, as you're rightly pointing out, it's not really 5%. It's 3.5% on core military and then 1.5 on kind of other related stuff. And even at that, you can fudge what is included in those numbers. And what I don't understand about Sanchez's move is just commit to it. And we've seen this play out with 2%.
And don't follow through. That's what the Europeans do all the time. After I remember covering this, the European Council, like they would, remember when they were trying to break up the refugees and resettle them, they would commit to things and then not follow through. This is how the European Council works.
It's an old,
they get together
without question.
They agree to things, they sign the same communique, and then they go back to their countries and then they don't do it.
Right. And then
that
there's
is the European story.
There's, you know, a pandemic, and, you know, we're going to have to delay our commitment on whatever it was. So I don't think that this approach is going to be successful. I've been talking to a number of folks here in Spain about it. And ultimately, I do think that Spain's going to pay a high price. But also, as we've seen, and this is what's going to be interesting about 5%, Trump got them to commit to 5%, but that in total is over $1 trillion in spending. And these are countries that don't necessarily have a lot of extra cash sitting on the table. And Trump is trying to hit them also on the tariff side. So they're going to have a good argument now saying, look, we've just ponied up hundreds of billions of dollars for weapons. You can't also undermine our industries that are going to be necessary for generating that money to reach the 5%. So the interconnectedness here is an important issue, one that Trump doesn't always, quite frankly, grasp. And I think, you know, Europeans will work now on trying to educate him in terms of how the security stuff is going to actually impact the tariff stuff.
Yeah, and on that, just from a European or from a British perspective, I suppose, Brett, you're absolutely right. You know, they've now committed to spend this extra money, and a lot of European countries really don't have any money left to slosh around and play with, as you say. And then they've been hit by higher tariffs by Trump, and also the threat that he's not going to support them anymore against Russia with the war in Ukraine, which also threatens European security. I think a lot of Europeans sense, or the sense in Europe from a lot of Europeans, is that Trump is just a bit of a bully. And if you look at the tourism figures from some European countries to America since he came into office in this second term, they've really dropped. There've been a lot of people canceling their trips, a lot of people not traveling to America. Do people care about that in the States?
Well, I don't think they fully appreciated it, because I was on a flight back a couple of weeks ago, and in Dublin Airport, you know, they have the pre-clearance where the Americans line up and the EU passport holders line up. There was nobody in the non-American line. You're getting these reports from tourist communities saying that numbers are down. The Canadians are not coming down to Florida in the winter, and just wait for next year. All of this, quite frankly, is really worrying. I think it's, you know, tourism. Let's also, you know, take account of the billions of dollars that foreign students bring into US universities and US communities. So at the end of the day, I think what Trump is trying to do is this kind of shock and awe. The difficulty is he has not been a consistent player, even when, like in the case of the USMCA, Canada and Mexico signed what he called at the time, the gold standard in trade deals, and now he's whacking them with, 125% tariff. So why should I make real compromises if I know that Trump is just going to come down the path and hit me again? I think this is something, he is going to face increasingly as we get into the back half of this year and then further on into his term. And also, the publicizing of Rutte's text messages, it may give him a temporary sense of self-importance. Look at how much credit the Secretary General is giving me. But I guarantee you world leaders are going to be a lot more circumspect when they're sending messages to Trump next time.
Yeah. You know what, though, Sal? I will be honest with you, though. It's popular at home politically. Like, who wants to have a weak world leader on representing them? President Trump looks like he's going into a summit and he looks like he's getting wins. That's a lot better than, what we had before, which was basically President Biden barely showing up, barely able to speak, not coming home with anything. It's popular. You could ask a Democrat or a Republican. They don't want to cover they don't want to pay for the security of Europe, especially when there are wealthy nations there, like Germany and France, some of the top UK, some of the biggest economies in the world. So I think, people don't stay up at night.
Nothing compared to the firepower of the American economy.
But at the same time, if you talk to an American who's not making much money or doesn't have health care or they're not staying up at night thinking like, we should be helping NATO more. No. They don't think like that.
I get that this is playing well at home. I just think it'll be really interesting to see how this plays in Europe.
I think he's right. I mean, honestly, this is I think a lot of people, regardless of party, are thinking it's about time that Europe stepped up, and it's not even a real stepping up. It's over 10 years, and that infrastructure that they're investing into their own countries. It's kind of like when we do infrastructure week. It's like you're actually investing in your own country. And like Brett said, you don't even know what it is. They could be building roads to air bases that benefit their residents. It's hard to say what it is.
Yeah, the boundaries of where the spending has to take place is quite loose by the sounds of it. Brett, just because you've been at The Hague, rubbing shoulders with all these very influential people when it comes to the world's defense, what have they been saying about the situation in Iran? What is the sense among NATO members about America getting involved in those strikes in Iran? What are people saying?
There were no tears shed in The Hague at the loss of Iran's nuclear program. And you heard this from the likes of German Chancellor Merz. On the other hand, there was a lot of concern that Trump is increasingly going it alone, shooting from the hip, not coordinating, let alone communicating in advance of some of both these attacks, but also just some of these new proposals, the Gaza Riviera. And NATO is at its core an alliance. It's designed to be a coordination mechanism. So I think there is concern, one, about Trump will continue to engage in these kinds of attacks. And he also obviously has still threatened to invade a NATO ally himself in Greenland, let alone Canada, and then obviously Panama. So all of this does leave a sense of unease. But I have to say, the biggest unease that remained in The Hague was whether or not Donald Trump would actually come to the defense of a NATO ally that was attacked. You could feel this in the Baltics. The Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians are very worried that Trump, depending on what Fox News is spinning that day, depending on what Laura Loomer feels is worthwhile or not, the Estonians may find themselves on their own. And I think Putin will test this and try to see how far he can push Trump out of the way and to break that, bond between the NATO allies.
And just for context, Brett, as I'm sure you know, Article 5 was last triggered after 9/11, right? And so allies like the UK joined America in their operations in Afghanistan for 20 years. And I spent 6 months in Afghanistan during that time. And I've spent a lot of time filming with American and British forces over there, Danish and Estonians. Interestingly, as you say, Estonia takes their membership of NATO extremely seriously because they are one of the smallest countries in Europe and because of their close proximity to Russia. When I was in Helmand province when the drawdown began, as they began to pull out, Estonia was one of the last units to leave because they take their NATO membership so seriously.
They need to. They're right on the border.
Right. But the fact that they were there for America for 20 years in Afghanistan. And now
you would see when Trump said increase your NATO membership fees, the first ones to raise their hand were Poland. They're on the border with Russia. They understand that the importance of NATO. Of course, you're going to be the last one there. You need that country.
The point I'm trying to make here, T, is the fact that Estonia was there to the bitter end with America in Afghanistan.
I went to Afghanistan while they were there. It was mostly Eastern Europeans.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is the fact that they now feel vulnerable, that America wouldn't be there for them, is a very sad place, I think, for the NATO alliance. Brett, what's your take on it?
Yeah, and it isn't forgotten in places like Estonia that, they sacrificed, they lost soldiers, and there are soldiers who came back injured with the scars of battle. And look, that is really, I think, tearing at the fabric, not just of NATO, but I think of the Western world. And I worry, I've talked about this since Trump's first term, that we are well and truly in a post-American era, because the U.S. simply does not want to play. And this was true for Bush, as it was true for Obama, as it was true for Biden as well. We don't want to play the same role that we have. We don't want to be the guarantor of international security and stability and standards. But what it means then is we're going to have these spheres of influence. You're going to have a European sphere. You're going to have a Middle Eastern or a Gulf sphere. You're going to have the US, obviously, Russia, China, etc. But we're seeing more friction. And that kind of friction is popping up in places like India and Pakistan, like Azerbaijan and Armenia. And that's what worries me about the period that we're entering into. Because if, for instance, Trump says, I got to have Greenland for national security reasons, well, Putin kind of said the same thing about Ukraine. Erdogan may say the same thing about Armenia. So all of these, quite frankly, lead to a very chaotic, a very crisis-prone situation. And at the end of the day, who is, and this is where it gets interesting, just briefly coming back to Iran. Trump loves to quickly roll out, I've got a ceasefire, I've got a peace agreement. Who's monitoring it? Are we truly going to implement a ceasefire and eventually a peace deal? And are we going to stick to that peace deal? The U.S. used to be that bastion of stability. You could count on. Our politics ended at the water's edge. And we believed in projecting a unified front to the world. That's no longer the case. And I think, adversaries are taking full advantage of it.
Brett, thank you so much. That was really interesting and so great to meet you.
Likewise.
Yeah, thanks for dropping in, and safe travels on your way back to the U.S. Thanks for giving us the readout from The Hague. That was another episode of State of the World. Thank you so much for joining us. As usual, leave a comment, share this show with your friends, subscribe. We'll be back again, hopefully next week. But if we have to do another emergency pod, which I hope that we do not have to do, we will be here. And of course, check in throughout the week. We'll be dropping in news, notes, and shorts.
Yep, great to see you guys. Thanks so much for joining us.